So welcome. It's really lovely to see you in person. Um, Tell us all about yourself, Oliver. Give us a little bit of background.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Um, yeah, my journey to being on this is quite a probably strange or interesting one, I suppose. My first ever job was as a cricket coach. I used to coach the under 12s when I was 15, and I suppose I've been on a journey working in sport and human performance in a variety of ways since then. So right now I'm a senior lecturer in performance psychology at King's College, London. Um, I spent some time in my gap year coaching cricket and working in a school in PE, and I studied sports science in Swansea. I studied human movement sciences for a master's in the Netherlands in Amsterdam, and my PhD is in decision making and anticipation in cricket. And my background's in what we'd call skill acquisition in sport, optimizing training environments. Um, and since my PhD, I've done work in lots of different settings: military, sports, emergency services. But then also, since moving to King's 5 years ago, we're a very healthcare focused university. And I now work in a psychology faculty where I teach psychology students and sports medicine students. So alongside kind of continuing to work in skill acquisition, I've been working a lot with our ADHD lab here, on particularly to start with exercise and ADHD, and exercise as a symptom management tool. And whilst doing that project completely separately to work I do with coaches, coach development type work, and having lots of conversations with coaches about players who've had specific individual needs in their training sessions. I've got to a point now where I suppose I'm just starting out in a journey of doing research in neurodiversity in sport. And that's only been going for a fairly short period of time, but the research in neurodiversity of sport has only been going for a very short period of time too. So um, my background and expertise is in skill development, motor learning, perceptual cognitive skills in sports and other high performance domains. And I'm now interested and have been starting to work on how we can support our talent pathways and optimize learning environments for everyone. And I guess that is how we've ended up here. So a bit of a journey, but that's the background.
Brilliant, thank you. Two things. I want to understand what an ADHD lab is. And then secondly,
Yeah,
I I'm so pleased you're doing what you're doing, because when I was researching the ADHD in sport book, it was very easy to find evidence on how sport and exercise can help someone with ADHD. Like, there's a massive evidence now, particularly for children, but actually more of the research is spreading into adults too, about the huge benefits of exercise in
yeah,
helping with emotional regulation and helping with lots of the stresses that will show up in ADHD. It was really hard to find anything on how ADHD can help you in sport, and on how we can develop interventions that will help athletes who have ADHD. So in the book, all of those sections are just from the work I do with athletes. There's just no evidence base for
yeah.
them. Is that something you're trying to fill?
Yeah, that's exactly where we're at with this. Like you say, exercise is good for almost everything, and including all the co-occurring conditions that are really common with ADHD, like autism or other mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. So exercise is great for the population. It's also, if you look at the other direction away from the clinical literature, excellent for cognitive performance. So if you'll see things like how exercise will impact cognitive performance, but we don't have any information on how to create sports environments that are inclusive for people with ADHD, for example. And the gap we're trying to fill is how we can make our talent pathways really good for people with ADHD. We don't even know how many people with different types of neurodiversity are in different sports. So it might be that sport is actually super inclusive and is a really good place for people with ADHD, which I think we would probably have some anecdotal evidence of from talking to athletes and things like that. So that's the gap we're trying to fill for sure, is how we can support athletes with ADHD in pathways or in grassroots sports or in all different settings, to be honest. And then also what kind of benefits you might be able to get, or how we can work with the strengths of ADHD as well.
Yeah. I mean, I was working with a
Mm,
school recently
mm.
where they've estimated 50% of their first team students have ADHD. So it's a huge number. So it might be that actually that world is really inclusive. And if you've got coaches who have ADHD and they've come up through sports, been their safe place, so they've stayed
Mm.
in sport and they're coaching, and that means
Yeah.
they can have a brilliant insight into what some of the struggles might be for those athletes with ADHD, and they can make it a much more inclusive place. What
Yeah.
I'd love to also hear though, what's the ADHD lab? I've got this image
So
of like proper lab coats and test tubes.
Lab is actually it's actually a bit of an Americanization language that you use to refer to a group of people doing research together. In some domains, it does involve actual labs. For us, it does as well. We have like our eye tracking lab and our neuroscience labs where we do lots of experiments in there. The ADHD lab is a group of people here at King's and the Department of Psychology. It's led by Professor Ellie Dommett, who is an ADHD neuroscientist. But it is a vast group of people with myself, for example, working in sport and exercise. We have lots of people working on inclusive education. We have neuroscientists working on the fundamental underpinnings of inhibitory control, which is, so we have all ends of the spectrum, like how do I make a classroom inclusive through to what's happening in the brain of someone who has ADHD, and working in what is one of the biggest mental health faculties in the entire world means we can draw knowledge from an outstanding neuroscientist, a brilliant clinician, someone who's an expert in inclusive education, all together around the topic. And the ADHD lab is, if you just search ADHD lab KCL, you can read about the work that's going on in there with Ellie and the team. So yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, thank you. And what's first on your list? Where are you starting off with your kind of research?
I would start every piece of research I do with talking to the people who are actually going to be affected by it. If we were in medical language, we'd call it PPIE, patient participant engagement and involvement. So we're out talking to coaches and athletes, doing qualitative work at the beginning, and some of has already been done as well. Sam Wood at Manchester Met has been doing some work like this as well. We've got Erin in Australia who's published a scoping review in this space. So that's a great place to start. We also really want to find out how inclusive sport is for people with ADHD. This is actually an incredibly difficult question. There was a really good paper from my department a few weeks ago that basically says we don't really know what the prevalence of ADHD is in the general population. There's lots of suggestions that it's going up, but if you actually dig into the literature, there's lots of pretty either difficult, low quality pieces of work. There's different ways of measuring ADHD, and the idea from that paper was like we're not really sure what's going on in the general population, let alone in sporting populations. And we have lots of reports, like you mentioned, of people saying lots of my players have additional needs or have ADHD or other things. We have lots of anecdotal reports, but we don't actually know accurately how inclusive sport is for ADHD or any other kinds of neurodiversity as well. So the two kind of ends of the spectrum would be, one is a very scientific, right, we need to survey loads of people and try and find out what's going on, and therefore have some kind of way to say, right, this is something that needs or warrants investigation, which is a kind of practical tool for helping build the research. But the other end, which we'll always do first, is start talking to people about what they think they need to know. Coaches, for me, I've talked to a lot over the years, and everyone has some kind of idea of best practice or different ways to support their own athletes, but it's not at the moment part of any kind of coach development training or anything like that. So that's where we'll be starting. I've got a PhD student who's starting in the autumn in partnership with Neurodiverse Sport, who are a not-for-profit aiming to promote neurodiversity in sport. So with them, we're setting up what we call a research advisory board, where we have people with lived experience who advise on the priorities for research. When you're starting a completely new topic area, which this almost is, like you mentioned, and there's lots of evidence that it's good for you, but how we can actually deliver it is there isn't much. So we'll have a research advisory board who will lead that project in partnership with Neurodiverse Sport, who are people who are lived experience experts, and we will help them design research, and they'll help us decide what we need to prioritize, because we can investigate almost anything at the moment.
So much to investigate.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in your background as skill acquisition
Yeah.
and then moving into ADHD. One of the areas that often comes up when you're looking at some of the difficulties is motor development.
Yeah.
And obviously we think sport can significantly help that because you're having very focused time,
Yeah.
focused on motor development. Is it an area where you've started to look? Like, how do those two tie together for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We actually, when we were looking at exercise as a symptom management tool, lots of people, for example, who are on closed waiting lists and things like that, will look for different solutions, and exercise is definitely one. We were really interested in exercise addiction, because someone with ADHD has a high likelihood of addiction, and also injury, because we were looking at thinking motor development issues, you're more likely to get injured if we engage you. So it's almost like thinking about side effects like you would with any other kind of treatment. What we found is obviously ADHD is very often co-occurring with autism, and autism can be co-occurring with something like developmental coordination disorder. So it's much more of a complex picture than being like, you have ADHD and therefore you're going to have poor motor development. There's lots of co-occurring things. We have found from some of our studies that someone with autism might be more at risk of getting injured, for example. Now, at the other end of the non-clinical spectrum, in my background in skill acquisition, lots of our literature is about how do we help someone get to the right level of cognitive effort to learn something better? How do we design really realistic training environments, which might involve lots of different information sources, for example? And if you read that evidence base about training design and optimizing motor learning, there's no literature at all about individual differences in how it's very much a group based. On average, if we make someone have this level of difficulty, will on average get better. And that for me is how this knits together really interestingly. I've always had interest in cognition and how it interacts with learning motor skills. So there's those two ends, one about the kind of clinical element, and the other end, which is my original background in research, which is how do we optimize a training environment? Well, the answer is different for everyone, but we don't know what those differences might look like for someone with ADHD.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And so much of the research feels like that in sports psychology. So it's like, well, we know this works probably for about 50% of people. We just don't know which 50% you are in.
Yeah.
So absolutely, it's brilliant to be able to see more specific research being done on that. I'm interested in that. If you're autistic, you're more likely to have injury. Do we know the reasoning for that?
I'm not an expert in autism, but from that paper, it was a large survey study focusing on ADHD, exercise addiction, and therefore injury. So if you have exercise addiction, you might have repetitive strain injuries or more likely to get injured. And from that study, we also investigated if people had co-occurring autism, which is very, very common. And we didn't find relationships between ADHD and injury, but we did find some relationships between autism and injury, but we didn't measure any mechanisms about why that might happen. But you might want to grab a autism and motor control expert, of which there are quite a few outside the sporting domain, to answer that question. But I don't know the mechanisms. We didn't measure it in that study that we did. But it's something that we always keep an eye on with something like, if we're going to suggest to people that playing sport is going to be really good for them, we always have to be measuring the things that might not be good for them at the same time.
Okay. So it sounds like from that,
Yeah.
coaches need to keep a really strong eye on their neurodivergent athletes over overtraining, potential addiction issues, and being able to keep them slightly safer from injury. And we have seen some of the underlying reasons that those with ADHD might be more likely to get injured. Might be some impulsivity that shows up. They're more likely to take risks. Phenomenal ability to see patterns of play on the pitch, but almost their brain is working ahead of their body often, and that means you're more likely to trip over, or you're more likely to get injured in some of those ways. That there was the feedback we've had with kind of interviewing individual athletes. with
Yeah,
it.
there's some good literature out there that does exist on concussion as well, which
Concussion is one of the areas I've probably had most people message me about from the book, and I could have written a whole chapter on it,
yeah.
because there are so many different elements. What have you seen around concussion?
Just from reading, if you check out the scoping review, which is in an open access British Journal of Sports Medicine Open. It's a scoping review on neurodiversity in sport, which basically means what exists. A scoping review is not saying trying to answer questions, it's just saying what exists in a field. And in the field of neurodiversity in sport, if you take a look at that, which is open access, you just search scoping review neurodiversity in sport, you'll find a few papers which have looked at things like concussion testing, because they're all quite cognitively demanding tests, and concussion assessment can be a bit of a challenge in ADHD. Not a question that's really been asked whilst developing all these concussion protocols. But again, it's not loads. It's maybe a couple pieces of research, which in most fields would be basically nothing. But it's all we have in this area at the moment.
And another area that feels like it's rising and being discussed a lot more recently is hypermobility. And as to whether that is a neurodiversity, how it shows up, we think it's about 4 times more likely to show up amongst those who have ADHD. A fascinating paper I read when I was researching for the book suggests that with hypermobility, your amygdala is larger. So your threat system is bigger. And then you start thinking about it, particularly girls that we put into sports like gymnastics or trampolining, where they're having to be high, they're doing a lot of backward skills, and perhaps they are seeing threat and building that anxiety more than you might otherwise. And you might then well have lots of the ADHD symptoms on top. They're ending up in quite a difficult place, really struggling with. We often see when they lose moves, lost move syndrome, because suddenly they're just totally freezing because they've got so much going on with the hypermobility, the ADHD, and then scary things that they're doing. They are unable to progress forward. Is hypermobility something you've seen coming in at all?
Not really, to be honest. In the sports specific literature, I think what you just mentioned is a really good point, where we know lots in other places. We know lots about inclusive education. We know lots about the neuroscience of ADHD. We just don't know how it applies to sport. We don't have any data apart from things like talking to athletes, which is really valuable. And what we're trying to do is just start recording that so people can learn from it, as you've done in your book as well. But hypermobility is not something that we have looked into at this point in time, but it's one of those things where, like you just mentioned, you can learn from a few different areas of the literature and think about what might happen to athletes, and then ask your athlete or target that problem, or think a little bit about how you might be able to approach that. But it's not something that I have any evidence about, I would say.
As one of the
Yeah.
only
Mm.
researchers
Yeah.
or sports psychology
Mm.
researchers in ADHD, what's the biggest, the question you would most like to be able to answer?
For me, it's about what are the really simple things that we can all do to make our environments as inclusive as possible. And like we said, they might already be really inclusive. We just are not sure. You know, at King's, we have our basic rules of inclusive education, which means you don't actually need to really do much else apart from follow some really basic principles, and then the classroom is better for everyone.
Yes.
But we don't know how that would look on a football pitch or a basketball court. For me, it's about what are really simple things that can help a coach make sure that someone who has ADHD has equal opportunity for support, equal opportunity for progression, and what are the really easy wins in that area to get things rolling and make it a very simple to implement findings from our work. And there's a lot of appetite for thinking about neurodiversity, where ADHD is a difference and not a deficit, and we are looking at strengths as well. And there's certainly a lot of appetite for looking at strength-based research in this space as well. That's something I am interested in too, but it's for me, it's more about what the simple things where we can create an environment where, for example, you might not even actually need to get a diagnosis from an athlete because you've created an environment that's great for everyone and gives everyone great opportunities to show whatever their strengths are.
Love that. Yeah.
And I know of people who are doing this already, or trying to implement things which are based off education literature, and stuff like that, which is great. And it might be working really well or it might not. So for me, it's about just starting to know these things and what are the simple things we can do to make sure all of our sporting environments make the most of everyone's strengths, but also help support everyone with whatever their needs are. And at the moment, we're just not sure what the specifics for people with ADHD are in sporting environments.
Yeah. I've noticed there's been a few people when I've been doing conferences talking
Yeah.
about the book
Yeah.
who've been very clear. This is what going to be 5% of my 100 kids I've got on a Saturday morning. Why do I have to change my whole approach just for a few people? But they are massively outweighed by the people who are like, wow, the tools we're talking about here would probably benefit all of my athletes. Then I don't even have to talk about neurodiversity. I just have some sessions that work for everybody. And that is so joyous to hear. And yes, absolutely. It sounds like your basic rules of kind of engagement in education, if we can develop those with an evidence base behind them for sport, then we don't need to know whether somebody has an individual difference or not. They actually just work much better for everybody.
Yeah, and like that's the dream goal, and sometimes that'll work and sometimes it won't, and I think that you have to accept that as well. But that would be kind of my approach to this. But sport has a lot of nuances. So for me, working in skill acquisition, I'm often working with talent pathways where talent ID, scouting, those kind of things are a big part of it. So it's going to be about developing great training sessions, and that's really accessible. But something like, oh, right, we're currently scouting for how someone acts whilst they're listening to the coach, for example, and
Yes.
making notes on these kinds of observations, or interpersonal skills with their teammates. And like, there's loads of other things which come into like selection, which doesn't exist in education in the same way. It does in the business world, where there is some good stuff about neuro-inclusive recruitment, for example. But we have these nuances in sport, and I think we can have my number one kind of starting point would be simple things that coaches can do everywhere. But then there's going to be some very specific questions about things like selection, and how to make sure that is very inclusive as well.
Yeah, I've been working
Yeah.
a little bit in the equestrian world recently. And it's like you're not just dealing with people, you're dealing with horses. And you've got so many different nuances. And a horse is going to pick up on how someone's feeling, however good they are at masking it externally. That horse will notice. So it's really interesting the nuances that show up in sport in a way that we would never even think about
Yeah.
in other parts of the world, and the individual differences between those sports.
Yeah.
Is there something you would say to coaches right now that you've already kind of seen, maybe from those scoping reviews or kind of papers you've read of like, this is where you might start?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Obviously, I would say to any coach at any time, and as would most people who work in coaching or with coaches, is knowing your players will always be very, very useful for you.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to have a conversation. And one of the things we want to develop is like a conversation tool. Like if you have someone who thinks they need some adaptations to training, have a conversation. But things like some kind of basic things that might go on in the classroom, like not asking people why, getting annoyed at people for being late, not making people do something in front of the group. These are like very basic inclusive education things that you might implement. And there's going to be small bits like that you could do at different coaching sessions, depending on the kind of context that you're in. And just for me, take some time to talk to some athletes and learn a little bit about what might need to happen in your own kind of environment at this starting point. But we also don't want to be just making work for work's sake, which is why having some evidence base about what is important is a really good place to start. And obviously, as a psychologist, we don't really know much about the sports psychology side of it. We don't know too much about the coaching side of it. So I wouldn't want to go in and say, oh, let's do all of this stuff that happens in other domains, which might not be useful and cause loads of unnecessary effort as well. Like, I'm a very pragmatic person about how a sport environment is, and a coach is a busy person. But there's often going to be things that might make everyone's life easier, which might be simple wins. And like, you know, something like, don't tell someone off for fidgeting when you're doing your team talk. That might be the way that they are best listening to you. Does it really matter if that is happening? Probably not. It's just something that you've decided kind of suggests that they might not be listening, but they probably are, for example. So there's tiny little things like that which take no effort to implement and actually don't really make that much difference in your setting, but could make a huge difference for an individual person as long as you have some understanding of them. So yeah, I think about small wins. Knowing your players is a place to start. Learn from other domains if you can, but it might not be something that transfers really easily from a classroom or a PE lesson into a coaching environment. And you know, engage with us. Like, there's lots of appetite right now. We've been talking to lots of different governing bodies. Neurodiverse Sport are doing a lot of workshops. And just engaging and being open-minded to learning about ADHD and how it might be affecting people that you work with is a great place to start. And if you can help us find out what you need or the things that you need, there's going to be quite a few different research projects coming out in this area in the coming years, I think, because as you will have noted after the book, there is a lot of appetite for knowledge in this space, but not a lot of evidence to give. So engaging with us in developing it, engaging with the players, making this a group effort to make sport better for everyone is a really nice way to think about it.
Brilliant. And if people do want to engage and they want to learn more about what you're doing, where can they find out more?
Yeah, good question. The best way to contact me is either going to be just look up Oliver Runswick on LinkedIn, or just Google Oliver Runswick. Weirdly, I am the only person with my name, it seems, that appears, so it's quite useful for a search engine optimization. You'll find all of my contact details on the King's website. And also we have the ADHD lab. If you Google KCL ADHD lab, you'll find contact information for other ADHD related research, which is going on as well, which can be really useful. And being in that environment and learning from other domains is great for us too. So do reach out. We're going to have lots of stuff going on. We'll be at the Games Conference, the International Conference for Mental Health and Sport, which is in Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in November. And I know a few colleagues from around the world will be at that who are also looking to develop ADHD research in sport in other countries as well. So keep an eye on that. If you're a conference going person, then there's going to be some neurodiversity in sport things there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you.